This is the third video in this series focused on the unique challenges in educating a deaf child who is adopted. In the first video, I gave an overview of the various aspects of adoption and how those things can impact a child's educational process. In the second video, we covered the topics of trauma and neglect, discussing how these things impact brain development, functioning, and ultimately learning in children who have experienced these intense stressors. In this video, I want to talk about the issue of loss and grief. All children who have been adopted have most often experienced arguably the most significant loss a person can experience. In losing one's family of origin, some very basic aspects of who we are and what we have depended on for our very survival is lost. Even when this loss occurs immediately after birth, there is a loss and a grieving process that occurs and often continues in some form throughout a child's life. The loss experienced by children who are adopted is a different kind of loss than many of us are familiar with. The concept of ambiguous loss is very helpful in gaining a better understanding of what adopted children go through. Ambiguous loss can simply be defined as a loss that occurs without closure or understanding. Closure in relationship to the loss is the idea that we come to an acceptance of the loss and find a way to fit it into our narrative about who we are and where we're going in life. This is considered a healthy aspect of grieving in that it allows one to move forward and reinvest in life based on a realistic perception that incorporates the loss in a healthy way. One of the situations that a person would experience loss that's ambiguous would be for a loved one to go missing. This prevents the person from moving forward, not knowing if they will ultimately face tragedy and loss or joy and reunion if that person is found. Not knowing what has happened to their loved one prevents them from beginning to try to come to terms with or even accept that loss, leaving them in a state of excruciating uncertainty. Author Pauline Boss describes the impact of ambiguous loss on a person in this way. The greater the ambiguity surrounding one's loss, the more difficult it is to master the greater one's depression, anxiety, and family conflict. Adopted children always experience ambiguity around their loss, and this occurs for a number of different reasons. Foster children are typically in a situation where they don't know if the loss that they have experienced is temporary or permanent and final. They have often been given conflicting or unreliable information about whether they will return home or not, and therefore they don't know how to deal with the present or even face the future. Even if children have been given consistent messages about the loss of their birth family, they can often experience denial about its finality. It is common for adopted children to have fantasies about reunification with their birth family, and they may be clinging to these fantasies to ward off the overwhelming feelings that would come if they were to accept the reality that they are facing. These fantasies are very resistant to change in many children and should only be challenged by individuals who have earned the child's trust and are working with the adoptive family and preferably a professional to make sure helping the child move forward does not do additional emotional or relational damage to them in the process. Another cause for ambiguity is that for adopted children, there is a lack of a clear symbolic ritual surrounding the loss. The grieving rituals that societies have developed are very important in helping a person work through and accept the loss they are facing. For adopted children, there are no established ritual or practices that aid them in identifying and processing the massive loss that they've experienced. In fact, they're often faced with the opposite and a discordant message that adoption is only a joyous, wonderful event, often leaving the child feel as if they shouldn't be grieving at all, but should be happy and joyful along with their adoptive family. A third contributor to ambiguity is the fact that the lost relationship or relationships are not socially recognized or are often hidden from others. As an adopted child enters into a new social world, they quickly realize that even though these new people in their life may be safe and loving and kind, these people are clearly not experiencing or talking about the fact that the child has lost everything and everyone that was important to them. Even though the child may have better stuff and nicer, more competent caregivers, the child still feels an unimaginable loss that no one else around them feels and often is never even acknowledged. In addition to the loss not being recognized, the griever themselves are not typically socially recognized as someone who is grieving. This leaves the child feeling very alone and misunderstood in their feelings of grief and loss. And often, their efforts to communicate these feelings are misinterpreted as anger, attitude, or behavior issues, without the understanding of the deep pain and fear that the loss has triggered in the child. To make the situation worse, the circumstances that led to the loss are typically perceived negatively by others, whether it was a drug addiction or criminal behavior by the birth parents, or abuse and neglect, or a lack of ability to care for the child due to intellectual or financial limitations, or even the death of a caregiver. The vast majority of situations that led to a child needing to be adopted are viewed by society as shameful or embarrassing. Children begin to pick up on this very quickly and begin to internalize that shame in themselves, which creates a massive roadblock for them in grieving the loss that they've experienced. So in addition to the mental health impact mentioned previously, ambiguous loss also tends to prevent a child from recognizing normal and healthy roles and relationships in their new family. This further interferes with the grief due to the fact that it can block new family members' ability to provide comfort and guidance to the child trying to come to grips with the loss that they have experienced. I'm hopeful that this discussion about ambiguous loss allows you to have a better grasp of the immense and complicated nature of the loss and grief that often faces an adopted child. Because children often do not grieve in the same way as adults, we can easily miss or misunderstand behavior and communication if we're not aware of grief's significant impact on an adopted child's functioning and development. As we examine grief and loss in adopted children, an important question is, what is the impact the grief and loss has on that child? In studies examining this question, we see that children who are grieving have difficulty adjusting to changes and making decisions. Particularly in the early years of adoption, their lives are defined by change. But even as they settle into a new family and culture, any new changes and decisions, even small ones or even positive ones, are more difficult when a child is grieving. Any new losses, even the ones that are a normal part of life, like not getting to do something they wanted, or not getting an object they desired, being rejected by a peer, getting a bad grade. All of these smaller normal losses have the potential to tap into the overwhelming sense of loss that they carry around. As such, they can trigger major overreactions that are difficult and confusing to both the child and to those around them. A sense of helplessness and hopelessness can also settle into a child's perception and thinking. This can manifest itself in a child who doesn't even try things that they are likely to be capable of due to the fact that they're convinced that they are helpless and powerless to achieve something. The hopelessness fits right in by convincing them that no matter how hard they try or how much they want something, they're always going to be disappointed. So it seems better to them not to hope for good things to happen. The hopelessness can also be a major motivation killer in learning new skills or changing behaviors, because they can become convinced it's pointless to try and to change or improve things. As mentioned previously, children who are dealing with loss often struggle with depression and anxiety of varying degrees. When these symptoms become more severe or entrenched, they can become another impediment to the child's development in all spheres of life. Finally, children frequently respond to grief and loss by taking on the responsibility for causing that loss in some way and feeling intense guilt as a result. This guilt is not bound by logic, and even when it is rationally clear the child didn't cause the loss of their birth family, they often still struggle with the feelings that somehow they did cause it, or at least they deserved it. So in conclusion of this section, as an adult concerned about the education of a deaf adopted child, it's important to keep in mind that grief is always some part of the picture for them. And as such, when academic or behavioral struggles are present, it's important to look for evidence that grief and loss may be contributors, and then examine ways to address that factor. In brief, children typically just need space, permission, and sometimes some guidance to do the grieving that they need to do. In addition to making others aware of this potential cause for the problems the child is having, advocating for counseling services for this child is a great place to start if you see this as a contributing factor. The final area of focus for this talk is attachment. It may be the broadest and most important aspect of understanding the specific challenges facing adopted children. Attachment is affected or even determined by the other topics we've discussed. A break in attachment is also the core reality of children who find themselves in need of an adopted family. So let's wade into the critical and complicated topic by starting with a definition. One of the early researchers who significantly shaped the field of attachment was Mary Ainsworth. She defines attachment as an affectional tie that one person or animal forms between himself and another specific one, a tie that binds them together in space and endures over time. Most of us are aware that the attachment or bond between a child and their caregiver is a good thing, maybe an important thing, but how could bonding impact behavior and learning for a child? This topic could easily fill many presentations, but I want to present an introduction that can be useful in understanding adopted children and addressing their unique needs around attachment. The early attachments a child forms, especially before birth, through the first years of life, lay the groundwork for later development in virtually all spheres of a child's life. Research has provided strong evidence that what happens relationally in these first few years impacts the child's ability to form connections and maintain relationships with others as they grow and mature. It also has a strong effect on the child's ability to regulate themselves physiologically, behaviorally, and emotionally. Children who have experienced significant problems or breaks in early attachment almost always demonstrate great difficulty in dealing with their own emotions and managing the resulting impulses to behave in problematic ways. Emotional awareness and healthy expression of emotions is also negatively impacted by disruptions in the attachment process. This emotional dysregulation often becomes disruptive to learning in the educational process. It's helpful to understand that one of the primary ways attachment impacts a child's functioning and development is by creating what we call internal working models that a child uses to understand and navigate the world around them. An internal working model is a cognitive framework in which the child has a specific mental representation that directs how they make sense of themselves, of others, and the world around them, and how the world operates. All of these factors that we have discussed up to this point factor into whether a child develops a healthy or secure attachment with their primary caregiver or an unhealthy or insecure attachment. Now, insecure attachment can be broken down into several types, but for this talk, it's most useful to focus on this binary of secure and insecure attachment. This next slide provides a very basic overview of this concept of internal working models and how they differ in children who are securely attached and those who are not. A securely attached child has experienced a responsive and loving caregiver. This means that when they express a need, it's responded to. And when that need is responded to, it's done so in a way that is loving, meaning that the need is met in an appropriate and safe manner. The caregiver must also meet the need consistently, demonstrating that their care can be trusted or relied upon by the infant. The internal working model that develops from a responsive, loving, and reliable caregiver is one that sees the world as safe, other people as trustworthy, and views the self as worthy of love and attention. In contrast, a significant failure in one of those three aspects of caregiving, what we call abuse or neglect, creates a very different internal working model in a child. An insecurely attached child sees the world as a dangerous place. It views other people as untrustworthy and sees the self as ineffective and unworthy of love. Now imagine the difference in behavior that these models make for a child. In the exact same environment with the same loving people, a securely attached child will generally act as we would expect them to and in a way that is comfortable and enjoyable to us. By contrast, a child who sees the world as dangerous will be fearful and high-strung. A child who sees others as untrustworthy will not be compliant, nor will they genuinely give or receive affection. A child who sees themselves as ineffective will not have the confidence to try new things or be motivated to engage in new information and experiences. A child who sees themselves as unworthy of love will not be able to receive or trust another person or their attention and affection, nor will they be able to learn to give or receive love and attention from others. The other important thing to know about these internal working models is that they are very stable and enduring, meaning that they're resistant to change. And even if they are not working well for the child or for those around them, they continue to stay present. But the good news is that while it is difficult, it is not impossible to begin to modify these foundational beliefs. But we must be aware of them and their influence on the child's functioning and tailor our interventions to address them. As I have already said, this is an extremely shallow entry into a rich and complex arena of attachment in theory and practice. But I believe it's critical to have an understanding of this foundational developmental process if we're going to be able to understand adopted children and maximize our effectiveness in removing the barriers to their healthy development and learning. So in light of the concepts of trauma, neglect, grief and loss, and attachment theory, how can we best support and maximize learning in deaf adopted children? The first way is by educating ourselves and others about these unique challenges that adopted children have. This is the primary purpose of this video series. I'm hopeful that as your knowledge of these developmental concepts grows, you'll be better able to understand adopted children and more accurately interpret their behavior, which will then lead to more appropriate and effective responses to that behavior and interventions with those children. Secondly, I believe it's crucial for adopted children to have more understanding and flexible environments that can accommodate and address their specific emotional and behavioral needs. Sometimes even minor adjustments in classroom expectations and methods of handling problems can make the difference between a child gaining confidence or losing hope. Behavioral specialists, counselors, and psychologists have the tools to help identify and implement these kinds of environmental changes. Parents can also be a huge resource as they are the experts on their own child and have typically learned quite a lot through trial and error that may be quite beneficial to the educational context. Thirdly, providing additional opportunities to develop the social and emotional delays that result from all of the things we've discussed are crucial to maximizing both the current functioning and the future development of these kids. This can occur in a one-on-one experiential learning about social and emotional skills, and it can also happen in group settings focused on development of these skills. It can also happen in the classroom level, where children will benefit from enhancing and practicing their social, emotional, and relationship skills. Lastly, working with professionals who have a solid understanding and experience with trauma and attachment issues can be very helpful in dealing with some of the very challenging situations and behaviors that you can encounter with adopted children. So I want to say thanks for your time and your energy that you've already and will invest in this group of children who are very close to my heart. Thank you.